At 70, I understand that losing health doesn't start with illness. It starts with assumptions. At 40, I assumed I had time. Now I see how a handful of overlooked choices shaped my strength, my independence, and the limits I live with today. At 40, health felt like a background setting in my life. Always there, quietly doing its job, rarely demanding attention. I didn't ignore it completely. I went to the doctor when something hurt badly enough. I noticed when I was unusually tired. But I believed, deeply and without question, that serious health concerns belonged to a later chapter of life. Old age was where fragility lived. Middle age was for endurance. That belief didn't come from arrogance. It came from momentum. Life at 40 was full. Work deadlines mattered. Family responsibilities filled the calendar. There was always something more urgent than a routine checkup, more pressing than listening closely to small discomforts. When the body whispered, I assumed it was just tired from carrying so much, and when it fell silent again, I took that silence as proof that everything was fine. What I didn't understand then was that health rarely announces its decline loudly at first. It doesn't arrive with a single dramatic moment that forces reflection. Instead, it shifts quietly. Recovery takes a little longer. Energy doesn't quite return after rest. Minor aches settle in and stop leaving. These weren't alarms to me. They were inconveniences, things to push through, not signals to pause. I also believed resilience was permanent. I had bounced back from illness before. I had worked long hours and recovered. I had stayed up late, skipped meals, and carried stress without visible consequences. Each time I recovered, it reinforced the idea that my body would always adapt. I mistook adaptability for invincibility. Looking back now, I see how often I postponed care, not because I didn't value my health, but because I assumed time was on my side. I thought I could always start paying closer attention later. Later, it became a habit, and habits, once formed, shape decades. The cost of that delay wasn't immediate. That's what made it dangerous. Nothing collapsed at once. Life kept moving, but beneath the surface, small neglects accumulated. Things that could have been corrected early became things that needed managing. Things that could have been prevented became part of daily life. At 70, I understand that health is not something you catch up on. It's not a project you return to when life slows down. It's a relationship that responds to attention, or the lack of it, over time. Treating it as something that could wait didn't feel reckless at 40. It felt practical. Now I know it was simply unaware of how quietly time passes. The transition into the next decade didn't feel dramatic. It felt familiar. The same habits, the same assumptions, the same pace, just with a body that was beginning to keep its own record of how it had been treated. The choices that shaped my health most were never the big ones. They were the small, repeated decisions that felt too minor to matter. At 40, convenience felt like a reasonable trade-off. Life was busy, and efficiency seemed like wisdom. If something saved time or effort, it felt like a win. Food was one of the first places this showed up. I didn't think of my eating habits as unhealthy. I thought of them as practical. Meals were something to fit between responsibilities. If it was quick and filling, that was enough. I told myself I would eat better when life settled down. I didn't realize that life rarely does. Movement followed the same pattern. I stayed active in ways that felt natural, walking through workdays, lifting things, staying generally busy. Structured movement felt unnecessary. I believed activity embedded in daily life was sufficient, and for a while it was. What I didn't see was how easily that baseline erodes when routines change. Rest, too, became negotiable. I slept when I could, not when I needed to. Late night felt manageable. Early mornings felt productive. Fatigue becomes normal, and anything normal stops being questioned. None of these choices felt like neglect. They felt like adaptations to a full life. And because the consequences were delayed, I assumed there were none. The body adjusted, quietly compensating. But compensation isn't the same as health. It's boring. Over time, convenience stopped being a temporary solution and became a default. Intention faded. I wasn't choosing habits anymore. I was repeating them. And repetition is powerful. It shapes posture, energy, digestion, balance, and resilience in ways that are invisible year to year, but undeniable over decades. At 70, I don't blame my 40-year-old self for wanting ease. Life was demanding. But I wish I had understood that daily care doesn't require dramatic effort. It requires consistency. And consistency is built from choices so small, they rarely feel important in the moment. What surprises me most now is how those quiet choices define my physical comfort later. Energy levels, flexibility, the ease of getting up from a chair, the confidence to move without fear. These aren't determined by one decision. They are shaped by thousands. As this realization settled in, another truth became harder to ignore. It wasn't just what I did during the day that mattered, it was how often I ignored the need to stop. Rest was something I treated as optional, almost indulgent. At 40, pushing through fatigue felt like responsibility. There were people counting on me. There was work to be done. Pausing felt like weakness, or worse, selfishness. Sleep became flexible. I took pride in functioning on less. Stress was something to manage later, once things calmed down. I told myself I would rest when I earned it. When the pressure eased, when life slowed, that moment never arrived. What I didn't understand then was that rest isn't the absence of productivity. It's what allows productivity to continue without cost. By ignoring it, I wasn't gaining time. I was borrowing it from the future. The body is generous at first. It adapts. It carries stress quietly, but it also keeps score. At some point, fatigue stops responding to willpower. Sleep becomes lighter, shorter, less restorative. Tension settles into muscles and doesn't leave. Concentration fades more quickly. When rest is delayed long enough, the body stops asking politely. It demands attention through breakdowns that are harder to ignore. What once could have been corrected with better balance now requires management and limitation. At 70, I can see how years of pushing through shaped my nervous system. Calm became harder to access. Recovery took longer. Small stresses felt heavier. This wasn't sudden aging. It was an accumulated strain. I don't regret working hard. I regret believing that rest was something to postpone rather than protect. The cost wasn't just physical. It affected mood, patience, and the ability to be present. Constant fatigue narrows life. It makes days feel shorter, choices feel heavier, and joy feels distant. Learning this late has been humbling. The body is not impressed by endurance. It responds to care. And rest, I've learned, is not quitting. It's listening. That realization opened the door to another truth, one that went beyond sleep and schedules. I hadn't been listening to myself at all. I paid attention to responsibilities, expectations, and outcomes. What I rarely checked in on was myself, not in any honest way. I noticed discomfort, but I minimized it. I felt stressed, but I explained it away. I told myself that what I was experiencing was normal for someone carrying as much as I was. This wasn't denial in a dramatic sense. It was subtle. It sounded like reassurance. Everyone feels tired. Everyone has aches. Everyone is stressed. By normalizing everything, I avoided asking harder questions about sustainability. I focused on what needed to be done, not on how it was affecting me over time. I measured success by completion, not by cost. And because nothing failed immediately, I assumed everything was working. But the body speaks in patterns, not emergencies. It repeats signals until they're acknowledged. When they're ignored long enough, they change form. What begins as discomfort becomes limitation. What begins as fatigue becomes dependency. At 70, self-awareness feels different. I notice how quickly my energy shifts. I pay attention to balance, to breath, to recovery. I wish I had practiced this earlier, not out of fear, but out of respect for longevity. Regular check-ins aren't about obsessing over health. They're about honesty, about asking whether the way you're living today is something your future self can carry. I didn't ask that question at 40. I assumed the future would handle itself. That assumption shaped everything that followed. Independence is often discussed as a financial or logistical matter. At 70, I know it is deeply physical. Health decisions made decades earlier quietly determine how much freedom remains later. The ability to move without fear, to manage daily tasks, to make choices without constant calculation, these are built long before they're needed. I didn't see that connection at 40. I thought independence was something to plan for later. Now I understand that health is the foundation beneath every other form of freedom. When it weakens, options narrow. Life becomes more carefully managed, more dependent on others' availability and support. This isn't a story of loss alone. It's a story of clarity. I see now how each earlier choice pointed toward this moment, not in a straight line, but in a quiet accumulation. If I speak now, it's not with regret meant to weigh others down. It's with understanding meant to steady them. Health choices are not about perfection. They're about direction. At 70, I live with the results of what I once believed could wait. And I know now that the greatest gift of caring earlier would not have been a longer life, but a freer one.